All right. Good morning, everybody. I apologize for the delay. We just had a couple of logistical issues internally that we had to resolve, but we're ready to go now. So today, first of all, my name is Alan Lilly. I'm the presiding hearing officer of the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. Today is December 8, 2022. It's just after 9 a.m. And this is a continuation of the Administrative Hearings Office's hearing in the court reference to the State Water Board in City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar. We had appearances yesterday, and it appears that I think it's all the same parties as we had yesterday. Are there any new appearances that people would like to make for today who did not appear yesterday? Okay. Not seeing any, we will go ahead and get started. So I believe our plan for this morning, as I said before, I have a pre-existing condition, a pre-existing assignment for a training seminar. I'm sorry, but I've had schedule conflicts in the past, and this is the last date it's offered, and I have to take it to maintain my job and avoid a personnel action. So I'm going to be out between 10 and 11, but let's go ahead and get started. We have time between now and then, and I believe the plan is for Mr. Moore to continue and hopefully complete his cross-examination of Ms. Nelson. Is that correct, Mr. Moore? But go off mute so we can hear you. There you go.
Good. I said I'll give it my best.
Okay, well, why don't you go ahead and get started? Don't talk fast to try to get through it. That just ends up being hard for me to understand. But obviously, the more efficient you can be with cross-examination, the better. So it's 9:06. And why don't you go ahead and proceed?
Great, thank you. Good morning, Ms. Nelson.
Good morning.
And just a reminder, Ms. Nelson, you're still under oath, the oath you took yesterday.
Yes.
Let me ask you a question that sort of outside of what we were talking about yesterday. Are you aware of a proposal to help the Monterey Basin and Monterey Valley to help the water problem by reducing the pumping in the wells by 50%?
Are we talking about the Salinas Valley Basin? Where are we discussing?
Salinas Valley Basin.
So I am not aware of any specific management actions that are currently being required within the Salinas Valley Basin. However, management actions are identified as one of the potential mechanisms to reach sustainability within the 180 400-foot aquifer subbasin GSP.
Okay, let me ask a little better, I guess. Are you aware of any proposals, not necessarily, but anybody proposing a 50% decrease?
No, I'm not aware of any specific proposal to reduce groundwater extraction by 50%.
Going back to something we talked about in our deposition, and that is, in moving down the line with this thing, you have never prepared a model that you think would solve the problems of our model, correct?
That is correct.
And why not?
Well, we discussed the potential of developing a model. However, the problem is that it's a very complicated basin, and we did not feel that we would have adequate time as part of this proceeding to do that. And we also, one of the things that EKI did over the last over a year and a half is develop a model for the Monterey subbasin. And the Salinas Valley Basin GSA has taken that model and is incorporating it into a variable density model for the entire Salinas Valley Basin. And we felt that if there was the potential at some point when that became available, that would probably be the best mechanism to for EKI to proceed with that type of analysis, because as I think I mentioned, that's been under evaluation for over also a year and a half. And there's been a huge amount of work done by Salinas Valley Basin GSA. And so for EKI to do that type of analysis for this proceeding would have been duplicative and very costly for MCWD.
So I think you told me during the deposition, the problem was that they wouldn't approve it and it was going to be very expensive, correct?
That's why that is correct.
Yeah. So you've never got the improvement from your client to build a model, get a better understanding of the conditions in the basin, right?
Yes, as I indicated, we have not created a model.
Yeah. The model that you're now talking about, the Salinas Valley, what do you call that model? Excuse me. The EKI model that you've been part of?
So EKI developed in conjunction with Salinas Valley Basin GSA, a model for the Monterey subbasin, and that was included with the GSP. And it is a model which is specific to the Monterey subbasin. It was developed in order to evaluate basin budgets, but it does include a lot of information. And it was then incorporated into the Salinas Valley Basin GSA's coastal model, which includes seawater intrusion and is a variable density model to evaluate seawater intrusion within the Salinas Valley Basin. And that's something that we are working and coordinating with Salinas Valley Basin GSA's consultants, Montgomery and Associates.
Have you ever tried, run that model to see what information you could get out that would help us in this evaluation?
Objection vague as to what model he's talking about.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Moore, just rephrase the question to be more specific as to what model you're talking about.
So this is Salinas Valley GPS, right? Am I correct about that? If not, please tell me what it is.
It's the Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency.
Okay. And what is your involvement in that with that agency at this point?
The Salinas Valley Basin GSA and the Monterey County MCWD GSA are both overlying agencies in the Monterey subbasin and the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. They are jointly responsible for preparing groundwater sustainability plans for those two basins. The Salinas Valley Basin GSA is also an overlying GSA in other basins within the Salinas Valley. In the 180, 400-foot aquifer subbasin and in the Monterey, EKI has worked extensively with Montgomery and Associates, who is the primary consultant for Salinas Valley Basin GSA, to develop models and an understanding of those two basins for the purposes of the plans.
I'm sorry, the purposes of the plans.
For the purposes of the groundwater sustainability plans. The groundwater sustainability plan requires that a basin model be included in the plan to evaluate groundwater budgets within each subbasin.
And when you can get that information, do you think that you will have sufficient information and a sufficient model to go back and analyze the increase in seawater intrusion and the damage to the walls? Or is that still 5 or 10 years away?
If you are asking if I were asked by MCWD to evaluate the slant wells on, with that model. First, I don't have a calibrated model yet, but I understand it is supposed to be available next year. I'm sure that it would take some additional calibration efforts in the immediate vicinity of the slant wells in order to be able to evaluate the impacts of those slant wells utilizing that model. Because it's a very large, you can imagine that it spans the entire coastline. And as such, it's not going to have the density of grid that would be required to evaluate the slant wells. That was not its purpose, but it would be a very good start in order to be able to evaluate the slant wells.
Okay. And you're saying you haven't been asked to do any of that up to this point.
Well, the model is not yet available. As I said, the model, we had anticipated that it might be available in June or July of this year. The last I heard is it would be the beginning of next year. As I said, it's a hard thing to do.
Well, my client did it, right? Cal-Am did it, and it did it in 4 months, as I understand it. Do you find that surprising? They moved that quickly?
I find that what they did was not of the same caliber of what's being done by Salinas Valley Basin GSA.
Why is it the same caliber? How do
The
you know
first
what
thing
the
is they aren't
Wait.
modeling.
And Mr. Moore, if you're going to ask a question, then let her answer it. You just asked one and then you asked another one right away. So please just ask one question and then stop and let her answer that.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, this is a variable density model, so it actually models seawater intrusion, unlike the model that has been developed by Cal-Am. It also includes more of the coastline. One of the issues that we had identified with the Cal-Am model is that it's not large enough to the south. The Salinas Valley Basin GSA model looks at the entire coastline. And one of the key things that it does is it actually calibrates to the historic movement of seawater into the basin. So what they did is not only did they calibrate heads, they calibrated the actual migration of seawater into the basin. And so you do two things. You not only look at what the heads are and how that could impact groundwater flow, but you look at how groundwater, basically how seawater has migrated, and it can take into account density effects as well. So it's a much more complicated and difficult model to calibrate, but at the end of the day, it provides more information.
Thank you. And I think you told me at the deposition, the problem with you had in analyzing the model that Cal-Am had provided is it was really difficult and really complicated. Can you compare for me the difficulty and between those two models? Because it's taken you 2.5 months, and I think you were complaining.
Wait. Just ask one question, please. Not long statements. Start over, Mr. Moore. Just ask a question.
Give me a comparison between the complications you were experiencing with analyzing Cal-Am's model and the ones coming up with this new model. You say they're both very difficult and very complicated.
Yes, both models are I would say that they have different challenges. So what I discussed in my deposition is that the way that the modeling was done by North Marina in the North Marina groundwater model, it's very cumbersome, particularly when it comes to recharge, because what they've done is they've combined two models. And I think as Dr. Kincaid identified, and I discussed in my deposition, normally when you run a model with ModFlow, you use the recharge package to evaluate how much groundwater is coming in and recharging into the basin. And you can easily see at that point what the recharge is. The way that the North Marina Groundwater Model 2022 did recharge was it used the well package. And as I said in my deposition, it's not wrong. It's just cumbersome, because basically what they did is they included thousands of wells to incorporate the recharge. And therefore, in order to evaluate how much recharge happened in a certain area, you have to pull that all out and then average it over the area that it's been done. So it's extremely cumbersome. And Dr. Kincaid probably can give you a better, explanation of exactly what he had to do in order to be able to even just back out what the recharge was within the model.
Okay, thank you. And you said 1,000 wells? I'm sorry, I may have misheard you.
You'd have to ask Mr. Kincaid, but I think you can see in his picture, I think one of his slides shows all of these little dots. Those are all wells. That's the way that the model actually included recharge, rather than just a recharge package, which, basically says I apply this much, this many inches per year to this area.
I understand. Thank you. Tell me, what do you think the reason was, or if you can, maybe you don't, why it took Cal-Am 4 months to create the model and you 2.5 months to try to analyze it?
As I said, it's extremely cumbersome.
Well, apparently not cumbersome to make, but cumbersome to an analyst.
If I could step in, since this is a board, I think I can speak to this perhaps better than Ms. Nelson, since we were the ones that evaluated the model.
I think that is appropriate. Why don't you go ahead, Dr. Kincaid, since that's why we do have the panel of witnesses here. Just not a rambling response, just a short, succinct response.
No, I understand, sir. And I just want to use a metaphor. And I'm sure that all of you can relate to having to pour through loads and loads of documents, some of which might be very long. So I would ask you to imagine the difference between having to pour through PDFs that are created as photographs versus PDFs that are searchable documents. So in the way that Ms. Nelson is describing, the Cal-Am model is a PDF created with photographic documents, as opposed to models that are constructed in different ways that would be like PDFs that are searchable.
Okay.
So one is significantly more cumbersome than the other to evaluate.
Could I ask a question of this witness also?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, as long as it's on this point, but go ahead.
It's on this point.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I understood with Ms. Nelson's testimony, that it wasn't a criticism of the model. It made it more difficult for you to understand it, right?
Exactly, as I hope to explain, the content of the document is different than the ability to access the content of the document. So the photographic PDF might be a very fine document. It just takes a long time to search and to read, because you have to do it page by page, as opposed to using a word search program to find what you're looking for quickly.
And in your mind, that explains the difference between taking 2.5 months and not completing the evaluation, and 4 months to construct it.
Yes, that's my intent with that analogy, would be to imagine the difference between trying to read a multi-thousand page document looking for a couple of keywords, as opposed to using a word search program.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kincaid. So, Mr. Moore, why don't you continue with your questions of Ms. Nelson?
Let me ask you a question, little off the mark that we were going, but do you have any quantitative technical analysis to demonstrate that proposed slant well pumping will cause the width of the seawater intrusion front to expand with the 180-foot aquifer?
I think that Dr. Kincaid's recent analysis, which indicates that there will be an increase in water migration, groundwater migration from the saline portions, basically the submarine portions of the aquifer outside of the capture zone, all the way along the boundary, the southern boundary of the basically south of the slant wells, is a direct indication that there will be additional seawater that enters the Monterey subbasin as a result of the slant wells. Now, the magnitude of that, of course, is difficult to estimate, and we've only used the existing models to make that estimate. So I can't speak exactly to the magnitude, but I think that with regard to the concept and the what we've been talking about, the modeling that Dr. Kincaid just did is basically proof of that hypothesis.
And again, if I may, since I did that analysis, the answer is yes. And the source is the CalAm model, speaks directly to increased seawater intrusion outside of the capture zone.
Okay, I think, Dr. Kincaid, your testimony, which you summarized yesterday, explains that. So I think we do have
Yes,
that
sir.
in the
Yes.
record. So go ahead, Mr. Moore, with your questioning of either witness as you deem appropriate at this point.
Mr. Lilly, just as an aside, not a question, I wanted just to note, this is a topic. This is David Osias.
Mhm.
Can you see me?
Yeah, now I can. You were hiding before. Go ahead, Mr. Osias.
No, I was just
know we're
saying,
going to hear from you at this point, but go ahead.
no, only to fulfill the administrative task, which was the new slide that was first presented yesterday on this topic is something we would like to note for Sir rebuttal. It was not in
okay.
his-
Yes, I think we have that, but Mr. Woolridge is listening carefully and is taking notes on that. So I will just ask him. He doesn't need to say anything now, but
Right.
to make sure that we note that CalAm's witnesses would like to respond to Dr. Kincaid's new slide on the groundwater budget, and particularly the amounts of seawater intrusion in reaches 1, 2, 4, and 5. So thank you, Mr. Osias. It's a little freewheeling here, especially since we're all by Zoom, but we'll get through there. So, Mr. Moore, we're back to you. I don't know if you don't have any follow-up questions for Dr. Kincaid on that topic, why don't you continue with your questioning of Ms. Nelson?
Well, one more question. When you were talking yesterday.
Wait, and just so we're clear, you have to make sure we understand who you're asking the question of.
Dr. Kincaid,
Okay, go ahead.
did you point to any quantitative analysis that shows what we just were talking about? And you said, I think, was our model showed. Is there anything beyond our model?
Not that I have evaluated, no.
Okay, go ahead with your question of Ms. Nelson then. Thank you.
One second, please. Ms. Nelson, we had a conversation during the deposition where I asked you if you had seen the most recent order by the Water Board and Ocean and the staff about the parameters of what you've been testifying to, which is the amount of groundwater and also the harm to the MCWD wells. And you said you hadn't seen it, correct?
Objection, vague as to what you're referring to.
Yeah, Mr. Moore, I think you may have broken up or blurred over. Are you referring to the most recent Coastal Commission order?
Yes, I am.
Okay, that was not clear in your question, so please
Okay.
restate your question and make it clear you're asking Ms. Nelson about the recent Coastal Commission order.
Thank you. So I asked you whether you'd seen the most recent Coastal Commission order, and you said no, you had, correct?
I believe you asked me if I had seen the staff report. I guess I don't know if that's the same thing.
Well, it was the same thing I was referring to.
Okay, and I had said at the time that I had not yet read it. And that I had, however, discussed some of the provisions with Tina Wang of my office, who had prepared a memorandum to MCWD for transmittal to this, basically to the Coastal Commission.
So you're saying right now that what you told me during the deposition was that you've had a conversation with your colleague, and that's what you had. So you looked at it and had a conversation with your colleague. Was that your testimony?
Objection, misstates testimony.
Yeah, first of all, Mr. Moore, we have to be really clear whether we're talking about the staff report or the Coastal Commission order. And then second, I think she said she discussed it with Ms. Wang of her office, but I don't think she said she read it. But maybe if you think that's still unclear, just ask her rather than, rather than stating what you think she said, just ask her whether she read any part of the staff report or just discussed it. I think that would help us get through this roadblock.
Did you read any part of the staff report at the time that we took your deposition?
At the time I took you took my deposition, I had not read the entirety of the staff report. However, I had discussed certain provisions in the report that that Tina had identified for me, and we had a discussion because she was preparing a letter on behalf of MCWD. And we discussed some of those provisions.
Okay, and Ms. Nelson, I don't think you're trying to be evasive, but did you personally read any parts of the staff report before you gave your deposition last week?
So in a Zoom call, she pulled up some of the special provisions that are part of the staff report. And we talked through 2 or 3 paragraphs of the staff report. So I had seen 2 or 3 paragraphs of it, but I had not read any other portion of it prior to my deposition.
Okay, thank you. That clarification is helpful. Thank you. Mr. Moore, you may proceed.
I asked you the question during that deposition. Let me ask you something. And I ask you, are you aware of the staff report on the Coastal Commission that came out, I think 3 weeks ago, that tentatively at least approved the project? Your answer, I'm aware the staff report came out. Yes, I have not actually reviewed it. I then asked the question of you. So you're aware that there are certain, and there's a list of special conditions that the Coastal Commission is placing on us, things we have to do before we get a permit. But otherwise, it seems they are approving it, and those have been looked at, those specials. And you answer, no, I have not. I've been very busy with this. With this, you said, preparing for my deposition.
Objection, is there a question?
Yeah, I'm
Mr. Moore, as far as this is an admission by a party opponent. If you want to offer these certain pages from the deposition transcript as an exhibit, that's fine. But at this point, you need to be asking Ms. Nelson questions. And I'm going
to get to the ultimate question because
okay, why don't you get to it now?
All right. I said, and you have not seen this before. No, I did ask my attorneys to send it, but as I said, I've been very busy preparing for the deposition.
Okay, so what's your question, Mr. Moore? I mean, she's already told us exactly what she did and did not do regarding the staff report. So what is your specific question?
I'm going to get to the point where I think she was not being truthful during this deposition. And if that's not important, I'll go away from this. If it is important to test credibility, I'd like to go forward and explain what she said and what the letter said that she sent to the attorneys.
Okay, well, maybe right now I have certainly not seen anything that indicates that she was in any way not truthful. So if you think there's something there, you're going to have to show us what you think, because as far as I can see, she testified accurately during her deposition and is testifying accurately today. So I'm not seeing anything that's untruthful or an inconsistency here. but maybe I'm missing something, so go ahead.
And my question was, and those, you have looked at those special conditions? No, I have not. I've been very busy with this. And I'd like to now turn to our exhibit 121 or 120. I guess.
Do you want to get up? Do you want us to post pages from the transcript of Ms. Nelson's deposition?
Yes, I would.
Okay, what we agreed to do yesterday was we will get that from our folder of deposition transcripts.
Right.
And then we will pull up the file of Ms. Nelson's, the transcript of Ms. Nelson's deposition. And then you can tell us what pages you want us to refer to. And then if you, and you can work with your colleagues after this, prepare an exhibit that has the cover page and the pages of the transcript that you're discussing, then we will consider accepting that as an exhibit rather than the entire transcript. So I don't know, Ms. Mullen, if you can please pull up the file of the transcript of Ms. Nelson's deposition and screen share that, that would be good. And then it's 500 plus pages, so you'll have to tell us what page you want us to go to.
Sure, that's not a problem.
But it just take a minute. It'll take a minute for it to load here. Okay, we now have the first page. Oh, this says it's only 128 pages. I think I was looking at something that was longer. Anyway, tell us what page you would like us to scroll to. We have on the screen the transcript of the deposition of Vera Nelson that was taken on December 1, 2022.
Okay, starting at page 85, 86.
Okay, do you want us to go to page 85 or 86?
Both. I was
We
just,
can only go to one at a time, so we'll start with page 85. Okay, we now have page 85 on the screen. Go ahead with your question.
what question? I'm sorry. Am I asking a question now? Or are we just putting this on the record?
Well, what do you want to do with it?
Well, I wanted to ask the questions, but right now I don't think it makes a lot of sense. If you really want it in the record, not a lot of questions about it, that's fine.
Well, I guess I would say that probably the most efficient thing is to put the pertinent pages into the record. And then, of course, you can make arguments about them. But if you want to ask her a specific question, that it has to be along the lines of, do you recall stating this in your deposition? And then you can state question and answer. But you didn't, what you did before that Mr. Brochard objected to was you just read it and you never put it in the form of a question to Ms. Nelson.
All right, and then turn to 87, please.
Okay, we'll scroll down to page 87 and go ahead. We have page 87 on the screen.
Line 6, I asked the question, and you have not seen this before, though. You answered, no, I did not ask my attorneys to send it. And as I said, I've been very busy preparing for this deposition.
Okay, so let's just stop right there. First of all, Ms. Nelson, are you clear? So we don't have to scroll back for several pages. Are you clear that this refers to the Coastal Commission staff report?
I'm having a hard time seeing it on the page. Am I missing something?
Oh, I don't know. Can you see our screen share?
I can see your screen share. Which line am I on?
This was at line 6. And I don't know, maybe Ms. Mullen, you can scroll out, make it a little bigger. That might help.
Yeah, oh, I see it now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so just take a moment. This is a little tricky because we're doing this all by Zoom, but we'll do the best we can. So the question at line 6 and 7 says, and you have not seen this before, though. And then the answer at lines 8 through 10 says, no, I did ask my attorneys to send it, but as I've said, I've been very busy preparing for this deposition. Now, Ms. Nelson, do you recall that this that's referred to on line 6 is the Coastal Commission staff report?
Yes.
Okay, and do you recall Mr. Moore asked you that question and you gave that answer?
Yes.
All right, now, Mr. Moore, you may ask your next question.
Thank you. And that wasn't true, was it?
It turned out after when you pulled up sections of the report later on in the discussion, the special conditions, I started realizing, oh, I have seen this. I've seen these specific paragraphs. And after the end of our discussion, I was asked by my attorney, have you in fact seen this? And the answer was yes, I had seen selected paragraphs outside of that staff report that I had discussed with Tina Wang of our office.
And when you came back and made it clear, it was after you'd spoken with your attorney, correct?
It was after I started realizing, oh, as you were showing it to me, I'm like, oh, I think I have seen that verbiage.
Can we just clarify one thing? Before you went to see your attorney, you didn't change your testimony. After you saw your attorney, you did, correct?
Well, I started asking, I'm like, oh, I think I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we discussed it and I'm like, oh, that's where I've seen it before.
That's where you've seen it. What do you mean by that's where you had seen it before?
In other words, that we discussed the fact that Tina had prepared a comment letter on behalf of MCWD to the Coastal Commission, and that she and I had talked about it during a Zoom call.
So let's go back to 120, please.
Excuse me, what is 120? You mean Exhibit 120?
Exhibit 120.
Okay, so we'll put, this is CalAm Exhibit 120, we will post. We'll do a screenshot. I don't think we've seen it before, but let's go ahead and get it on the screen.
Ms. Nelson, you have seen this memorandum before, correct?
Yes, that is the memorandum that Tina prepared that she and I discussed.
And this was actually sent on November 11th, correct?
Yes, apparently.
2.5 weeks before I took your deposition.
That is correct. I think it was at the same time I was preparing my SIR rebuttal testimony.
And if you look at the second page and all the way through, you did an analysis of the special conditions, didn't you?
All right, and Ms. Nelson, if you need to, we can scroll through this. If you remember this memorandum, then you may go ahead and answer the questions. But if you want, we'll be glad to scroll through this.
Yes, EKI did an evaluation of the special conditions. Tina Wang was the primary author. She did consult with me on certain things, so she put my name on it as well.
You wrote in this document, I see you are Tina, a $50 million bond. You're proposing this as part of this document. For the
Okay, Mr. Moore, if you want to ask us a question about a specific part of the memo, let's refer to it. Even if Ms. Nelson remembers it all very well, I haven't seen this before, and it would sure help me to follow it if I can see the text you're referring to.
So if you turn to, it looks like on this paragraph, or excuse me, page number 1 at the bottom.
All right, so we'll scroll down to the bottom of the first page.
It's PDF page 2 he's on.
Okay, so we'll go to the second PDF page. Okay, so where did it, okay. Now we're there. Okay, go ahead with your question.
Okay, so all the red in here is what you wrote or somebody else wrote?
It's what EKI prepared on behalf of MCWD.
So you had no involvement in printing this or constructing these different
The specific things that Tina talked to me about, I didn't discuss this specific thing with her. I know that she was in contact with REM and was part of several other calls as part of this. she and I specifically talked about the TDS concentrations and at how would we identify what was an increase in TDS concentrations that would be actionable. That was one of the things that we discussed. The other thing that we discussed was the need for background data as part of that. And it's later on in the letter. It's where she and I talked about how we might go about trying to monitor a potential increase in seawater intrusion, that MCWD would be able to assess the potential impacts of the slant wells. And that's what she specifically consulted me on.
And you remember all this pretty well right now, don't you?
I have since taken a look at it and jogged my memory, yes.
I believe you testified the other day that you are involved in the preparation of the Monterey Subbasin GSP, right?
Yes, I was involved in the development of the groundwater sustainability plan, which was submitted to DWR in January of 2022.
And if I can ask you, were you the principal in charge?
I was one of many authors of the document for both EKI, on behalf of EKI, as well as the Monterey, Montgomery and Associates, who works for Salinas Valley Basin GSA. I was a significant contributor to the document.
And were you a principal in charge? That was my question.
I guess I don't know what that means.
And so as part of that project, you are familiar with the Monterey Subbasin model that was constructed or is being constructed, right?
I am familiar with the model that was constructed, yes.
And it hasn't gotten approval yet, has it?
The Monterey Subbasin GSP has not yet been approved by DWR. It was adopted by Salinas Valley Basin GSA and MCWD GSA.
And do you know if it was calibrated well? Or do you know what the calibration is at this point?
Objection, vague.
I'm going to overrule that objection. I think the question is reasonable for her to testify what she knows about the calibration of that model that was included in the Monterey Subbasin GSP. Go ahead and answer the question if you can, to the extent you know, Ms. Nelson.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. Aaron Lewis from our office is the primary modeler that worked on the Monterey Subbasin model. I am familiar with some of its characteristics and calibration, but I'm not intimately familiar with it. I think the model was reasonably calibrated. However, one of the things about these GSPs and the modeling that's been done is it's considered a work in progress. And there were many areas where the model did not calibrate well, and particularly in the deep aquifer where there's very little data. And there are commitments within the GSP to obtain additional data and recalibrate the model as part of the next 5-year review. And that's something that we've already submitted grant applications for. This is not uncommon with these GSPs. They are very much a work in progress. You do what you can, you assess as best you can with the data you have, and then you update the model as more information becomes available and you can do a better job.
Is that the same process that goes through in a model like my client's model that we have provided to you?
Well, I think that Dr. Ye testified that he feels 100% certain with what he has already provided, and that it will not have any impact, that the slant wells will not have any impact. That is very different
Oh, sorry.
than what I just made. about the GSP.
Well, my question is to you, not Mr. Johnson. And I'm asking you whether or not the process you define as to what you have to go through to get this calibration right is the same process my client goes through. Or is it
Objection.
different?
Calls for speculation.
I think, Mr. Moore, you need to split it up. Are you asking her, is it her understanding that the CalAm modelers already went through that process to refine the calibration? Or are you asking her, is that something they should go through in the future? So I think you need to split it up into those two parts.
Well, but I'm really asking, the question I'm asking right now is it enough to go through the process? And you're not always successful, right? But the question is, did they go through the same process that Miss Nelson's client went through, or the person she was working for? And if so, I'd like to know it's the same or not the same.
Okay, so I think there's a valid question in there. It's just a little hard for us to follow regarding time frames. So
Okay, well, it's not, it's all, no, what my point is, Mr. Lillian, maybe I've been really unclear about this, and I apologize if I have, but I'm trying to find out, they had a model that they're having some difficulty properly calibrating. One of the main criticism of my client, it isn't properly calibrated. So if it isn't properly calibrated, did they go through, or should you go through the same process that they went through? And if so, why is it so important to criticism America calibration? I think that's what I'm trying to find out.
okay,
Just
well,
compare one to the other.
okay, and what's confusing is you keep saying they did this or they did that or they should do this. And I can't tell when you're referring to the Monterey Subbasin GSP and when you're referring to CalAm and when you're referring to what happened in the past and when you're referring to what you think should happen in the future. So there are two different variables, each of which have two different choices. So you have to specify which of those you are asking her about for each question, or the question is not clear to me or anybody else.
Mr. Lilly, if I may step in,
Not at this point, Dr. Kincaid. We
Okay.
have to first let Mr. Moore ask a clear question. And then if Ms. Nelson can't answer it and it's appropriate for you to step in, that will be fine. But at this point, if Mr. Moore wants to proceed with this, he has to first ask us a clear question.
Thank you. Ms. Nelson, I think in the last question, you answered that question with a description of the difficulties you've had getting the calibration of the,
Monterey Subbasin.
Monterey Subbasin. And you've told us why it's very difficult. You're going through all these different steps. You're making adjustments. I'm just trying to find
Okay,
out
so
what that is.
stop there.
Yeah.
Is that true, Mr. Nelson? Ms. Nelson, is that what you just said?
What I've said is that there's additional data that's being collected to aid in the further calibration of the model in places that we think it's necessary.
Okay.
And
I think that, go ahead, finish your response.
so, yes, it is an ongoing process, and in places, and maybe I can clarify. I mean, I think that the key is when you're calibrating a model, that the important thing is to understand the question you're trying to answer. And how good the calibration needs to be, and the specifics of that calibration really relate to the question that you're trying to answer. And if what you're trying to answer is what is the water budget for the Monterey Subbasin, then I look at the calibration of the model in that aspect. And then I find out what additional, if there's very specific concerns I have with, for example, there have been discussions about what are the cross-boundary flows that are coming in from the seaside basin and how much water is coming from that basin. And if my model doesn't calibrate well at that boundary, then now I have to go out and get additional information and recalibrate there. And so in some cases, it may not matter, but for the question that I'm being asked in that case, then I may need to go out and get additional data. So the level of calibration in a certain area is it's very important to understand the question you're being asked. For example, in the North Marina groundwater model, it doesn't calibrate particularly well in the deep aquifer, but I don't particularly care because you're not withdrawing water from the deep aquifer. In the case of the Monterey model, I do very much care that the deep aquifer is not well calibrated because we're getting, water levels that are declining in the deep aquifer. So I think it's really important to look at the question you're being asked and then decide whether or not your calibration is adequate. And I think that what I've testified is, I think the question that's being asked with regard to the North Marina groundwater model, which is whether or not this will potentially create additional seawater intrusion, and what is the drawdown that will be caused by the slant wells, that there is inadequate calibration for that answer.
Okay, so I think that's a good explanation of that part of the calibration question. So Mr. Moore, now if you have any follow-up questions, please go ahead, but please just make it clear whether you're at which model you were asking your question about and whether you're asking about past work or potential future work. And you can split it up and ask several questions, but each one should make it clear as to one of those two things, for one of those two variables for each of those two things.
The North Monterey model 2022. What was the construction of that model and what was it trying to accomplish as you understand it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very last part of that question.
As you understand it, what is your understanding as to what it's trying to accomplish and whether it did or not? But the question is, you said it's important. What was their goal?
In my opinion, what the model needs to do is to be calibrated adequately to answer the questions of whether or not the slant wells would create additional seawater intrusion within the Monterey and 180-foot aquifer subbasins, and whether or not basically what the drawdown will be as a result of the pumping.
And what are you promoting or what are you recommending, Callum, that will solve the problem that you see in the model?
What I think that Dr. Kincaid and I have articulated is that when we look at the model, there's been a lot of parameterization and assumptions made which are non-conservative. Now, a lot of times when we look at things, we go, oh, wow, you had a choice as to whether or not you could make this, hydraulic conductivity, this or this. And when we look at it, almost in every case, the assumptions that have been made are non-conservative. And it gives us huge pause as to the reliability of the model. And what we would like to see is a sensitivity analysis, parameterization to provide comfort that when you look at this and you go, hey, the flow actually looks like it's going where it's supposed to. And the recharge that has been included is average to maybe slightly more than what you would estimate. What is the range? What is the sensitivity of, this in other words, the results. And what, in my opinion, and I can let Dr. Todd Kincaid talk about it some more, is it seems that every time we look at this, like we looked at the OWP that the new model predicted during the test slant well, it dramatically over predicted what was seen. I mean, that does not give me comfort that this model is accurately assessing what the impacts of the slant wells will be. And maybe Dr.
We have to stop at 10.
All right.
So just get me a chance. And Mr. Moore, this will give you a chance to reorganize your questions again. Try short, specific questions rather than compound questions. It really will help us a lot. But we're going to sign off, and to give me a couple of moments to regroup after my other meeting, let's come back at 11:10 a.m. today. So it's best if you just mute and turn off your camera and then turn them back on, and we will be back at 11:10 a.m. Thank you. Okay, it looks like everybody's back. Thank you for accommodating my schedule or living with my schedule. It's 11:10, it still is December 8, 2022. And we will continue with our proceeding. Mr. Moore, you may continue with your cross-examination questions for Ms. Nelson, and then as necessary, if it comes up, for Dr. Kincaid. So please proceed.
Thank you. Hello, Ms. Nelson. How are you again?
Fine, thank you.
I want to ask you some questions about who you worked with on this model. When I'm saying this model, the Monterey Subbasin model. And at EKI, who was working with you?
The primary modeler at EKI that worked on the model is Aaron Lewis. And we worked jointly with Salinas Valley Basin GSA's consultants, Montgomery and Associates, and their modeler is Greg Nelson. And Derek Williams was also involved in some of the model discussions.
Thank you. Again, I didn't write this down very well, but is it, you say Cade Lewis?
Aaron Lewis, Aaron.
Thank you. And Aaron Lewis was a primary modeler in your facility, right?
He did the modeling for the Monterey Subbasin groundwater model. Yes, he was the primary. He had some help from support staff, but he is the primary modeler.
And support staff, what support staff helped him out in this project?
EKI, other EKI individuals.
Okay. Can you tell me their names?
Yeah, I believe that Saman Tavakoli, and I'm sorry, I'm very bad with last names, Tavakoli. I'd have to ask Aaron who else worked on it.
Was Aaron working on it full time?
No.
Huh. Did you spend any time working on the model?
I spent time reviewing and discussing the results.
Okay. So when it comes to the idea of analyzing the model, analyzing or running some information through the model, that was not your job, that was somebody else's job.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're about ready to give David Osias his chance here.
Okay, so is that it for you, Mr. Moore?
It is, Mr. Lowy. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Moore, and thank you, Ms. Nelson. I'm just going to make a note, 11:15. Mr. Osias, you're up. You may continue your cross-examination questions for Dr. Kincaid. And of course, as necessary, if there's carryover with Ms. Nelson, that's fine as well. So please proceed.
David, you're on mute.
Thank you.
There we go. Now we can hear you.
I was on mute. So I don't know if bad things happen in threes. The first bad thing was I spilled my coffee over in my entire sheet of cross-examination notes and keyboard. So I've spent the morning trying to mop up. But
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you can proceed. Okay.
I will.
Sounds like something I would do.
Yes, I'm trying to bond. How's that?
I don't drink coffee, but anyway, go ahead.
So, and second, I had my mute on. So I hope there's nothing else that'll show up in this exam.
Hopefully not.
When we finished yesterday late afternoon, I think my last question or questions was confirming that you primarily focused on the CEMEX model, the Hydro Focus 2016 North Marina model, the 2020 Weiss evaluation of the North Marina model. I use evaluation as a shorthand for the title. And of course, the August 2022 HWG North Marina model. And I think you said yes, but I just wanted to pick up that momentum from where we were. Is that?
Yes, just to be clear though, the STEMX model that I looked at, when I looked at the STEMX model, it was for work that I did back in 2017.
So not
So
again.
I didn't
Not
look at the
again?
STEMX model again
I'm sorry.
for this particular, for the since May. No,
Okay, thank you. I apologize. I talked over you.
no, that's okay.
So I'm going to just repeat so the record's a little clear. You did not look again at the CEMEX model since you started working again in May of 2022, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the 2015 to 2017 work was in connection with assisting others in the EIR process that was going to go on for the PUC hearings. Is that correct?
I was hired at that time period to evaluate the modeling that had been done and that was described in the EIR, specifically Appendix E2 of the EIR in the 2017 EIR. So I'm not aware of exactly what else that may have been used for, but that's how I was contracted.
Okay. And just to close the gap, the Appendix E2 modeling was the Hydro Focus 2016 modeling. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. And you are also aware that information on behalf of Marina Coast Water District about the modeling was submitted to the PUC.
Again, I presume so, but to be honest, I don't remember exactly who it was submitted to. I know I submitted my review to Mr. Wilkins and to the Marina Coast Water District, and then I'm not. I didn't participate in the actual conversations or or meetings, or so yes, I presume it was all part of the review of the DEIR, but since we're under testimony, I want to make clear what I know and what I presume.
Thank you. Okay. And if you didn't know, that would be a fine answer too.
Yeah.
All right. So, and when I used today focus, yesterday, I think I was more elaborate because I used your words where you open up the model, you take it apart. I can't imagine what that really means, but I don't need to know. You evaluate it and you run scenarios. That's what I meant by focus. That doesn't change your answer, right?
That's correct. Yeah, it does not change my answer. Yes.
Okay. So you did not look at the Monterey Subbasin GSP model.
I did not.
Okay. In fact, you didn't know as of your depot on Friday that model had been prepared by EKI. Isn't that correct?
I may have been somewhat confused. I believe, and I said in my deposition that on various occasions in conference calls, Ms. Nelson had described the modeling work that I now believe to be the one you're talking about, the one that Ms. Nelson just described in her previous testimony. So she had described that modeling work, and we had discussed why, just like she testified to just a minute ago, why she thought that model would not be applicable to the evaluation of the slant well pumping.
So when we took your deposition on Friday, and we can do what Mr. Lilly suggested earlier if we need to, but I'm trying to save time. So if you remember, when we took your deposition on Friday, didn't you testify that you had not reviewed the GSP model for the Monterey Subbasin?
I believe that's correct. And I believe I just said that I didn't review it, but then you asked if I was aware of it. And I said that we had discussed it in the meetings. So no, I have not reviewed that model.
Okay, I asked you on your depo, if you recall, if you were aware that it was prepared by EKI, and you had said no, but your memory today is different.
Object to the state's testimony.
I'm just saying, as I believe I've said before, that we talk about many things. We talked about the model that EKI had developed. I didn't review it. I didn't read the documentation supporting it. And so sometimes I'm confused by, the vernacular when people are describing different models. But as seems more clear now, I think that is the model that Ms. Nelson had been describing in our conversations.
Okay. And did you have a conversation with Ms. Nelson about calibration of that model?
About to the extent that she just got done testifying, saying that she didn't feel that the model was sufficiently calibrated, nor were the boundaries large enough to make it useful as a reliable tool to evaluate the test slant well pumping.
Okay. And Mr. Lilly, the Monterey Subbasin model and its calibration is something we would like to be able to comment on in certiorari rebuttal.
Okay, there are two different models here. Dr. Kincaid, I'm going to get to your point, Mr. Osias, don't worry. But first of all, Dr. Kincaid, I thought Mr. Osias was asking you about the Monterey Subbasin model. And you said, but then I wrote down, Ms. Nelson told you that the model was not sufficiently calibrated for review of the slant well pumping. Was that in reference to the Monterey Subbasin GSP model or the CalAm North Marina groundwater model?
That was in reference to the what I believe to be the Monterey Subbasin model, and perhaps since Ms. Nelson's here, we could make sure that that's accurate. But we had to. There was discussion about other models that may or may not be available to evaluate the North Marina proposed slant wells, and that was a model that was brought up and discussed briefly, and to the extent quickly that Ms. Nelson said that she didn't feel it was sufficiently calibrated or large enough to be a reliable predictor, that pretty much ended the conversation and my the extent of my knowledge about that model.
Okay, good. So now, thank you. And I think this is pretty clear, so I don't think I need to follow up with Ms. Nelson. But now, Mr. Osias, I'm back to you. Now that I'm unconfused on this point, I think, please tell me again what you want to be able to follow up with CalAm's witnesses about.
Calibration.
Calibration of which model?
Well, we've already got on your list the calibration issues related to the North Marina model. So I was adding the Marina, pardon me, the Monterey Subbasin GSP model.
Okay, I'm not following why that is relevant here. So maybe you can explain to me why you think that is relevant. I mean, it's a totally different model that was done for totally different purposes. And I think Ms. Nelson very clearly testified that it's still a work in progress and needs more work to be adequately calibrated. So how is that relevant to the issues that we are considering in this proceeding?
Partly, we don't believe that's true. The statement you just summarized. Okay, but more importantly, the flow from that subbasin into the Salinas Valley Basin has been part of the testimony yesterday. The impact going across that border, if you'll remember the title given to the litigation area, the interface zone has water moving back and forth between the two basins. And it depends on that model in part.
Well, wait. What depends on that model?
The movement of water across.
Wait. Movement of water doesn't depend on a model. I'm sorry to be nitpicky here, but this is really important.
Yes.
Models just model things. Water moves based on physical and geological characteristics. So I'm not following you right there. And I think this is important.
Yes, I could not agree more. So almost all of the testimony is predictive in terms of what we've been discussing about potential impacts, both from the slant wells in terms of direct causation and indirect causation to seawater intrusion in a large area, larger than the Salinas Valley Basin now, based on new material submitted yesterday. Zone
Not true.
5, somebody commented, but zone 5 on that slide 20, which is new work, is in the Monterey subbasin.
I'm a little confused, and I want to be able to follow. The 180, 400 foot aquifer subbase and the Monterey subbasins are part of the Salinas Valley groundwater basin.
Yeah, I think
They're not. Yeah, they're in the same basin. And if I'm not mistaken, I do believe the areas of both are included in the model domain for the 2022 North Marina groundwater model.
They're included in all of the North Marina groundwater models. This is the same model domain parts, yes.
Of those subbasins are in that. It's
That's
a
correct.
7 mile square model
Yes.
domain, I believe. Okay, so getting back to you, Mr. Assange, I apologize for the interruptions, although I didn't make them, but I still am not seeing the relevance of
Yes,
the status of EKI's and Montgomery's calibration of the Monterey subbasin model to this proceeding.
there are, I understand your question. So if
What
Let
is,
me
yeah,
try-
so what's the answer?
the answer is that model was used and relied upon in testimony to predict the movement of water in the no pumping versus pumping setting, which is what this.
Okay, wait a minute,
Going ac-
stop right there. I don't think that's correct. Dr.
Okay.
Kincaid, I thought you told us that you converted the 2022 North Marina groundwater model into a steady state model and used that to calculate the water budgets. Am I missing something, or is that what you testified to yesterday?
No, sir, that's exactly correct. We rendered a steady state equivalent for water years 2004 through 2013, and then used that to generate our analyses.
Yeah, so Mr. Osias, that's what they used. That's what Dr. Kincaid used to prepare, I'll just say, the analysis that was then summarized in slide 20. That's totally different than the Monterey subbasin model that Ms. Nelson talked about, and I don't think Dr. Kincaid has been involved with it all. So that's why I'm questioning the relevance here.
Okay, so first, I'm not making my argument based on Dr. Kincaid's reliance. And if you allow
I'm
me.
sorry, because you just said you were based it on slide
Predictive.
20, which was his slide.
Well, yes, and I think there's information that he used, but I could be wrong. But I know that that Ms. Nelson used it in her testimony. Even in her,
The pronouns are very important, very confusing here. You say used it,
use the Monterey Sub-Basin. I wish we had shorter acronyms, but the Monterey Sub-Basin GSP model in her testimony.
I don't think that is correct.
I will
Ms.
find
Nelson,
you the site if at the lunch break, if that is relevant to you. Because
well,
I have
Nelson-
it in
Ms.
her
Nelson's
testimony.
here. I think she can explain very easily and
just
quickly what she did.
calm down, Mr. Rochard. I'm getting
All
there. Ms. Nelson, did you use the Monterey Sub-Basin model in your testimony for this proceeding?
Now, what
So
I did was there is one citation to the Monterey GSP, Monterey Sub-Basin GSP, which is from the main tables of the GSP, which identify the cross-boundary flows between the Monterey and the 180-foot aquifer subbasin, as cited in the groundwater sustainability plan. Did not run the model for this purpose. I did not analyze it with regard to my opinions here.
So the only way the Monterey Sub-Basin model gets involved here is if it somehow was used to estimate the cross-basin boundary flows that are described in the GSP. Is that correct, Ms. Nelson?
That's correct.
And was the model used to estimate those cross-boundary flows?
It was.
Okay. So so Mr. Osias, that's it. That's the only way the Monterey Sub-Basin GSP model was used in Ms. Nelson's testimony. Now, so for that which was to determine the cross-boundary flows that are described in the GSP, Groundwater Sustainability Plan. So if the CalAm experts want to testify about or question or rebut the descriptions of the cross-basin boundary flows in the GSP, I think that is appropriate. But beyond that, I am not seeing any reason for them to testify about the calibration or other factors regarding the Monterey Sub-Basin GSP model. So am I missing something here?
Just in part, okay.
Go ahead. Tell me what you think I'm missing.
That it's a little bit of a beads on a chain, okay? So
Go ahead.
interbasin flow was predicted and utilized in this proceeding in connection with creating testimony about impacts. The prediction was from the Monterey Sub-Basin model. And I believe the testimony was also that prediction was reliable because that model was well calibrated.
I don't remember that testimony, but if you think there's testimony like that, you don't have to find it right now, but
Thank you.
please tell me where you think that testimony is. I mean, I've been trying to follow this pretty carefully, although it's admittedly complicated. But I don't remember that. I think Ms. Nelson, I mean, what she just said was she took the cross-basin or the cross-boundary flows from the GSP, but I don't recall her testifying about that the model that was used to make those estimates of those cross-boundary flows or whether it was calibrated. But if you can find testimony to that effect, please let me know. And obviously I'll give you time during the lunch break to look for that.
One other point, Mr. Lilly, if I could. I do believe that the references that Mr. Osias is now making is to Ms. Nelson's direct testimony. CalAm's already submitted rebuttal testimony.
What?
So this is Sir rebuttal to the direct. It has nothing to do with her rebuttal or her Sir rebuttal.
Okay, that, Mr. Rochard, I'm sorry, but that's not a valid objection because this is the first time Ms. Nelson has testified, and her testimony covers her direct, her rebuttal, and her Sir rebuttal. She never testified earlier in this proceeding. So it's fair game for Mr. Osias to ask questions and potentially to rebut her direct testimony.
Yeah, no argument with me on that. I was just saying, it seems like Mr. Osias is now asking for his experts to provide surrebuttal when they've already had an opportunity to provide rebuttal. That was the point of us, I thought, doing all of the written testimonies that we've done.
Okay, well, I'm going to give Mr. Osias flexibility on that. I mean, frankly, more details have come out as we've gone through the rebuttal, the direct and the rebuttal and the sur-rebuttal process, and we're honing in now on the critical issues. And frankly, I'm pretty sure this question of cross-boundary flows could be a critical issue, because that's a boundary condition for the North Marina groundwater 2022 model. And I think that is an issue that Ms. Nelson and Dr. Kincaid have raised, is whether or not those cross-boundary flows in that, or that boundary condition, which is assumes certain cross-boundary flows are accurate.
And Dr. Kincaid's on the line, but I think we're confusing things, and that's what I was trying to get at earlier.
Wait. Go ahead, finish, Mr. Brochard. What?
I think we're confusing things when we're talking about boundaries. The cross-boundary flow between the Monterey subbasin and the 18400 subbasin, whatever that is, should already be in or accounted for in the North Marina groundwater models. The model domain of the North Marina groundwater model already encompasses the boundary between the Monterey and the 18400.
You are right.
The boundaries are not.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's my bad. That's me trying to show some expertise in modeling that I don't have. So you are correct. And I'm sure Dr. Kincaid was going to say that. So yes, that is true. So that comes back, Mr. Osias, and I'm not going to put you on the spot now, but this is important. And if you think there is something here that CalAM's witnesses should rebut regarding an assumption or regarding the question of the boundary conditions, I think that's appropriate. I think Mr. Brochard is right, though, that the North Marina groundwater 2022 model does make whatever estimates it makes, including of cross-boundary flows. And that's not a boundary condition. That's flows between the two basins. So again, I'm circling back. I'm not sure exactly what it is you think the CalAM expert witnesses should be rebutting here. So with this colloquy, can you provide any more clarification on that?
If you don't mind my posing it as a question to you, Mr. Lilly, who's ultimately the judger of relevance here. But if 8,600 acre feet, if I'm doing it correctly from memory, is testified to by Ms. Nelson as the flow moving out of the Monterey subbasin into the 18400 subbasin, and that's not a well-calibrated number, or is a well-calibrated number, that should be relevant. And what rules do you use to determine if that's well-calibrated or not? Sort of, to use a colloquy, as Dr. Kincaid did before, what's good for the goose should be good for the gander. And there's a lot of criticism of what and how everyone else calibrated their models. I mean, hydrofocus, I mean, geoscience, and I mean, the most recent model. And we think it would be fair to see how someone who's relying on an 8,600 acre feet number calibrated that number.
I agree. That's very relevant, but I don't think now I'm going to turn to you, Ms. Nelson. We're getting to some nitty gritty here, but this is pretty darn important. So I want to spend some time on this. So Ms. Nelson, first of all, can you just clarify, what did you testify about 8,600 acre feet per year? Was that a cross-boundary flow estimate?
Yes, so.
Okay, and that's good. So it's from the Monterey subbasin into the 18400 subbasin?
Correct.
Okay, so then tell me what your basis was for that estimate. What modeling or other information did you use to make that estimate?
So in the Monterey, what I did was, in describing information about the interface zone, and discussing the connectivity of the sediments between basically the expanse of the aquifers between the Monterey subbasin and the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. I cited the Monterey subbasin GSP, and I stated that the GSP included an estimate that the cross-boundary flows between the two subbasins was estimated to be approximately 8,000 acre-feet per year. And that in the same way that I cited many things from the 180, 400-foot aquifer subbasin groundwater sustainability plan and its modeling results, I utilized that information that's in those plans to make that one statement.
Okay. And had you been involved in the preparation of that part of the GSP, the Monterey Subbasin GSP?
As I said, I'm not the primary modeler. I did review the results of the modeling that was done, but I am not the primary modeler and never actually ran the model for the Monterey GSP.
Okay. Thank you. I'm getting there. I appreciate all your patience with this. So, Mr. Osias, I think that's good clarification of, I'm not sure whether it's 8,000 or 8,600 acre feet per year, but I don't think it matters for this discussion. It may matter down the road. But first of all, how relevant is that to the critical issues we are talking about or want to address in this proceeding, which I think have been pretty clearly identified? I mean, the critical issues are, what are the amounts, if any, of additional seawater intrusion and locations that would be caused by the slant wells? And what are the changes in groundwater elevations and locations that would be caused by the slant wells? So an estimate of the flow across the boundary between the Monterey subbasin and the 180, 400 aquifer subbasin doesn't seem as directly relevant to that, but maybe I'm missing something there. So can you explain that relevance to me?
Probably not adequately in a few minutes at this moment.
Okay, fair enough. It's a complicated question.
And and I'm going to come back to these points later, I hope, but we have predictions of the impact of the slant wells under varying future circumstances, which both Dr. Kincaid and Ms. Nelson have described in their testimony as sigma either required or implemented. It varies in different places. And so the GSP plans, which depend upon GSP models, which have either a lot, or a little predictive of value based in part on the criticism we've heard about our models and its calibration standards. I think to get all of that on an equal footing for use, it would be helpful, A, to understand what was looked at and what wasn't. And I'm going to have Dr. Kincaid admit in 1 minute that he's never read the GSP itself for the Monterey subbasin, nor has he read the GSP for the 180-400 subbasin, nor has he reviewed the model for that. But he's very critical of the calibration of the North Marina model. And we'd like to know if he's using a different standard than EKI uses when they predict GSP consequences in their models, or is the standard for this area? I don't want to confuse things, but we have two subbasins and a general Salinas Valley area. Everyone's doing, that's a bad pronoun, sorry. There are lots of experts doing lots of models, Ours are singled out for a calibration challenge in part in this proceeding. And I think relative comparisons on those models and calibration is useful to understand whether the level of criticism directed in direction of certain experts is ignored and data used without that criticism by others, depending upon what law firm hired them or not.
Okay, well,
That's
so
a
what
long
what I'm
answer.
hearing, what I'm hearing you're saying is you correctly stated that Marina Coast expert witnesses have criticized the degree of calibration of the CalAm experts models, particularly the 2022 model, which of course is our most focused one. And you would like your experts to respond by saying something to the effect of when others, including at least the Monterey Subbase and GSA, have prepared models, they also have had, I'll say, calibration issues and may not have good calibration. So it's sort of like, well, if they shouldn't be criticizing the degree of calibration of our model when theirs also has a similar degree of calibration. Is that basically what you're trying to get at here?
Well, that's part of it, but the other is when they use those models to spend money and take actions. So the models, even with calibration issues, are good enough for that. So it's not just what you said, it's also, when are they suitable for what purposes? And obviously the purpose here is to predict the reality, probability, or speculativeness of the harm alleged by the water district. So it's a little more nuanced than what you said.
Okay, well, a little bit, but basically you're saying something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, but I think you're saying, well, they used their model, the Monterey Subbase and GSA prepared a model and it had calibration issues. Nevertheless, they used the results of that for their GSP that they prepared. And you would like your experts to say, basically, they made a major policy decision based on modeling work that had some calibration issues. And yet now they're turning around and criticizing CalAm when it urges the water board to make major decisions or recommendations to the court based on a model that also has calibration issues. Am I now getting at what you're saying?
Yeah, although two important points. One, I don't concede that we have calibration issues, only that we've been accused of having.
Well, I think that's what I said, but if I didn't, that's certainly what I meant. You've been
Okay,
accused.
and second, you asked an important question that I didn't know the answer to, so I don't want it to go away, which is assume that 8600 is or is not well calibrated. How important is that? And I didn't know the answer to that. And you might, and I might be able to find out that answer when I talk to somebody who's more conversant.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how important it is either. I mean, certainly the fact that there's hydraulic communication between these aquifers and these two subbasins is important because it can affect the impacts of the slant well pumping in one subbasin on potentially on the Marina Coast Water District wells in another subbasin, but in the same aquifer that's hydraulically connected. So, okay, well, I think we've spent enough time on this for today. And I'm sorry if I'm plodding and slow to understand this, but I hope Mr. Woldridge can sort this out in his notes that he's preparing, which of course we will be circulating to everybody. But I do think, Mr. Osias, you have raised valid points for, I'm going to just call it rebuttal. It's technically sur rebuttal. For CalAm's witnesses, I'll just say on the calibration issue, and it's really sort of what is the industry standard in this area on model calibration. And then this other question of, how important is the 8,600 acre foot per year estimate of flow across the subbasin boundary. So I think that probably takes care of that for now. I appreciate your bearing with me. I wanted to understand it, but I think it's for that purpose. Where I was confused initially was I thought you were suggesting that the Monterey Subbasin model had been used extensively for the Marina Coast witnesses' testimony in this proceeding. I think that is not the case. So unless there's anything further, can we move on, or do you have anything further you want to say on this point?
No, I had not anticipated the length of the detour. That's not a criticism. I'm just,
Well,
I have nothing further on my point.
Yeah,
And I want to,
I mean, we're starting to hone in on the critical points for this proceeding. So that's why I want to spend the time on it. So go ahead with that digression caused by me primarily with your questioning of Dr. Kincaid.
and Dr. Kincaid already heard my next question was, he has not read the Monterey Subbasin GSP, correct?
Correct.
Nor have you read the 18400 GSP, correct?
Correct.
And yet, at least in some of your modeling analysis, you simulate settings which you attribute to future GSP requirements. Isn't that correct?
To be clear, we ran this when we ran settings, we used the same settings that were prescribed in either the 2016 version of the model when we were evaluating those versions, or we used the same settings that were prescribed in the Weiss versions when we were evaluating them. And when we created our own analyses, we varied the specific parameter that the model was named after or that we described, such as the gradient. So when we evaluated how the 2016 version of the North Marina groundwater model would respond to a gradient of 0.0001, we changed the boundary condition on the eastern side of the model domain to reflect a gradient of 0.0001. And when we evaluated the same thing for the Weiss models. So we haven't developed our own model or parameterized or reparameterized any of the North Marina groundwater models.
So my question was much simpler than that, and yet you didn't answer it. My question was, did you not attribute future circumstances which you modeled to requirements of sigma? I mean, in words, didn't you do that in your testimony?
Yes, in my testimony, I attributed or correlated or described the flatter hydraulic gradient scenarios as demonstrative of what would be expected to occur according to the objectives as I understand them to be of sigma.
So I don't need to show you those words then. You agree. You attributed future gradients, some of them, to sigma mandates.
I attributed the flatter hydraulic gradients to those that would be consistent with the effort to meet the sigma objectives. Yes.
Okay, and you did that without reading either of those two plans, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Can I add something here?
I think you can. I think I was going to ask you some questions about your discussion of sigma objectives, Ms. Nelson. So while we're on that, go ahead and you, if it's on that point, go ahead, you may add that now.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to clarify that we did have discussions with Todd Kincaid. As you're aware, I'm very aware of all of the requirements within the GSPs. And we had numerous discussions with Dr. Kincaid about the GSPs. So the fact that he hasn't read them, I can tell you that we did discuss what the measurable objectives and the minimum thresholds were. And I told Mr. Kincaid that one of the basically the minimum thresholds within the 180 to 400 foot aquifer subbasin GSP was to stop seawater intrusion, and that the measurable objective was to bring it back to Highway 1. And we discussed how that might happen. And that's a basic hydrogeologic statement, which is in order to stop seawater intrusion in the absence of some form of a barrier, you have to raise the heads in the interior portions of the basin, and you have to reverse and/or at a minimum flatten the gradient. And I think that I don't think that he needed more information than what I've just relayed in order to be able to assess that sigma would likely lead to shallower gradients unless a barrier is constructed.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Osias, you may proceed.
Give me 1 minute, because Ms. Nelson's now testified to what she discussed with Dr. Kincaid. And I have my notes from his depot about what Dr. Kincaid said he discussed with Ms. Nelson. And when they're not in alignment, I need to read the depot exactly, okay?
Of course you do. And if you think it's important, you need to, or you should submit copies of those pages of the transcript. I mean, there's no better description of what Dr. Kincaid testified in the depot than the transcript itself. So if you think it's going to be relevant to offer those pages of the transcript as an exhibit, you should.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll do that at lunch and we'll come back to it.
Okay, I mean, that's gonna be far more efficient than going back and forth.
You know, it is, and I'm a little troubled by someone else testifying about what was discussed with a witness who testified differently.
Well, and here that is very important. And again, I'm not in any way suggesting that either Dr. Kincaid or Ms. Nelson is saying anything that's not truthful here. I think they're both trying as hard as they can to be 100% truthful, and I haven't seen anything to the contrary from that. But having said that, people's memories do, they're not perfect, believe me. I know, I couldn't tell you what I did last week on certain days. So what is important here, Mr. Osias, which you're bringing out, is Mr. Kincaid or Dr. Kincaid's understanding of the information he received about potential Sigma implementation. And I think if you're comfortable doing that by offering the depot transcript, that's going to be the most effective way to do that.
Thank you. Dr. Kincaid, do you remember testifying on Friday that you didn't know that the Marina Coast Water District was the groundwater sustainability agency for the Monterey Subbasin?
Yes, I do. Well, I don't. So I do. I will just acknowledge that I would have said that. To be clear, I haven't been contracted to render any opinions about sustainability or the groundwater sustainability plan. I've been contracted to evaluate the North Marina groundwater model and provide opinions about that. And the North Marina groundwater model came in several versions, including the Weiss models. And much of my vernacular followed directly through how Mr. Weiss described the purpose of his various models, some of which the flatter gradients in his work were described as models that were intended to represent what might likely occur at some point in the future when and if people meet the objectives of Sigma. So I've followed through with some of that same vernacular, but I haven't been asked to, and I haven't on my own gone and looked at the groundwater sustainability plans or other models, or the calibration results from other models. I'm just talking about this, that I've just looked at this model and the products or reports derived from it.
Okay, I think that probably clarifies pretty well what, from Mr. Osias, I think that clarifies pretty well what Dr. Kincaid did and didn't do on this issue, but please proceed with your questions if you have any more on this issue or move on.
Well, I was just going to summarize, I think, in a shorter answer, just to make sure we aren't confused by that narrative. You haven't rendered an opinion yourself about the impact of sigma on the impact. It's a double impact question, sorry, but how sigma will impact the impacts of the slant wells is not something you've opined on.
Not directly. I did, as you say, use the vernacular that correlated lower gradients to objectives for sigma, but I didn't do independent research on that. So to be explicit, I did not look at sigma. I looked only at gradients.
And you borrowed this sigma connection from Weiss, I think is what you essentially said.
Yes,
fair?
and the conversations that we, as Ms. Nelson just described, we generally talked about flatter gradients being associated with objectives under sigma.
Okay. And you've had no conversations with the modelers at EKI, correct?
Not directly. We've exchanged a couple of emails, which you would have received in terms of like data exchanges, but I have not had any conversations about the model or modeling procedures or results with anybody at EKI.
And for the 140, pardon me, the 180, 400 subbasin, you've had no conversations with the modeler for that GSP?
No.
And you haven't read that GSP?
No.
You haven't discussed that GSP with the author of that GSP?
No.
And you are familiar with the 1997 Montgomery Watson Salinas Valley Integrated Ground and Surface Water Model?
Only to the extent of how it's described in the reporting on it
Described by whom?
by the authors of the model in the publication on the publication that was rendered on that document.
Okay. Didn't open it up, take it apart, evaluate it or anything?
No.
And then there was a 2022 Salinas Valley model. I think it's July of 2022, authored by Mr. Durbin. And you haven't looked at that model, correct?
No, only the testimony and the very brief reporting that was provided on that model.
Provided by Mr. Durbin
Yes.
In this proceeding?
Yes.
Okay. And there was a 2008 geoscience North Marina mod flow model. You didn't look at that, correct?
Correct.
And there was a 2015 geoscience transient North Marina model, and you didn't look at that.
I can't recall about that particular one because that one was part of the data packages that we received when we were evaluating the 2016 model. So at this time, I may very well have looked at that model. I know I read that reporting on that model, but I can't recall.
That's not a good start. The 2015 transient model.
Yes, I understand exactly the model. That's the predecessor to the 2016 model.
Yeah. Okay. So you guessed my question, but that's not going to be a useful thing. You got it right this time. I just wanted to confirm. Hydrofocus converted the 2015 transient model into the superposition model, correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay.
Hydrofocus adapted the 2015 model by adding the dune sand aquifer and then recalibrated the model and then converted their version of the model to a superposition model.
So I wasn't correct because I was incomplete.
Well,
They
he described
didn't make
several
a,
steps that preceded the step you just asked him about. So anyway, but I think it's clear to me now.
Okay. And that's the hydro focus model is the one that you primarily focused on in that time frame from 2016.
that's correct.
Okay, that's what I was trying to confirm, not the one that had all those steps taken to it. The Monterey landfill has had a variety of studies done with respect to groundwater impacts, correct?
I presume so, but I have not looked at any of those studies or researched that.
Okay, that saves me my second question. And similarly, there's been contamination plumes found. I don't know if it's plumes plural, I apologize. Could be plume or plumes in connection with Fort Ord that produced a lot of studies, correct?
Again, I'm relying on the conversations that I had with Ms. Nelson about that. So based on those conversations, yes, I presume that to be correct.
But you have not read any of those studies, correct?
I have not researched those studies. I've seen a few of the references, but I have not worked to research or understand the results of those studies. That's correct.
And in your own experience, you have done modeling for pollution plumes, correct?
That's correct.
So if there were any modeling done for the Fort Ord pollution plumes, you haven't reviewed it.
That's correct.
And you did review the 2020 Weiss work, but you didn't review the 2019 Weiss hydrological review. Is that correct?
To be honest, I'm not clear on that. I reviewed the Weiss models that were provided to us, and I believe those are the 2022 models. So I don't believe that I looked at any of these other I don't believe I looked at that model, but I can't confirm that because there's so much crossover. I'm not sure what the 2020 model is.
And,
Okay, so
and I think you misspoke, Dr. Kincaid. You said 2022. I think you meant the Weiss
sorry.
2020 work. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And yet, just as an aside here, my staff has said we probably need to prepare some kind of a timeline or flow chart of these different models. Some of this is in Dr. Ye's testimony, but we may be calling on the parties to help us with that because we'll probably want to put text or an appendix in the report kind of describing all these different models and how they relate to one another, just so that people who haven't been sitting through all these days of proceedings, if they want to, can understand the relationships between these models. It's a little bit complicated.
and for
I
your
believe that would
staff,
be very helpful.
Mr. Lilly, the 2019 Weiss work is CalAm 63.
Okay, thank you. As I say, we'll see what we can figure out and what we need to ask the parties to help us with on this. Thank you.
And then Dr. Kincaid, there was a June 2022 HWG North Marina model, not the August 2022 transient model. Are you familiar with the June 2022 model?
Only to the extent that it's been described in testimony.
So not a model you reviewed or evaluated.
That's correct.
So let's go back to it's Marina Coast Exhibit 118.
Okay, do you want us to put that on the screen? It'd probably be helpful.
Yes, please.
All right, we will screen share exhibit MCWD 118, and I think that's slide. So tell us what slide number you want us to go
Yes,
to.
that's exactly what I'm going to look for right now. Actually, well, okay, I'm now out of sequence. Let me stick with where I was in terms of going through the modeling.
So do you want us to screen share?
No,
Not right now.
Not right now. We'll come back to that. To the extent it's helpful for your staff to know, we're going to use that slide deck again, and we're going to look at one or two slides from Ms. Nelson's, which I think is 117. So if
Okay.
those,
So we'll be trying to get them on deck here, but go ahead with your questions.
so I wanted to go to MC WD Exhibit 115.
Okay, we'll see if we can screen share that. I hope we can. Okay. We have exhibit MCWD 115 on the screen. Let us know what, first of all, I assume Dr. Kincaid, you're familiar with this since it's your technical report. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Sias, tell us what page you'd like us to scroll to. on
This
stuff.
page is fine.
Okay,
If we
what?
could scroll down. And to the paragraph, so we can get the whole paragraph on, that's good. You're in a good spot.
Oh, this is, I think this is page 1, isn't it?
It's page 1 of my document, but I don't.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you said you wanted us to go to page 5. You want us to stay on page 1?
Yes, right here.
Okay, go ahead with your question.
So in your examination of the North Marina groundwater model, you converted it from a transient model into 3 steady state models. Is that correct?
We converted the model to steady state and then replicated the 3 scenarios. Yes.
Okay. And in converting it to steady state, isn't it true that you limited the data utilized to that found within the years 2004 to 2013?
Well, we averaged the boundary condition assignments and the source sink terms such that we had one set of inputs for each of the models, and those inputs were the averages of those years. Yes.
And you're aware that the North Marina 2022 model used 50 years of inputs, correct?
Yes.
And then you used your steady state model to predict 10 years of impact. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the North Marina 2022 model used the 50 years of data to predict 100 years of impact, correct?
Well, the North Marina model is the 2022 model is a transient model. So it predicts fluctuating impacts, if you will, or fluctuating conditions across the 100-year simulation period. So they're different. One is predicting response, like you could think of it as an average response, an average if conditions are similar to those occurring between 2004 and 2013. The other predicts conditions that would fluctuate according to the monthly time step conditions.
And if we scroll down a little further on this same page, please. The last sentence of this page, is that what you meant by your testimony just a minute ago?
Yes.
The hydrofocus model used 30 or more years of data, correct?
I can't remember right now, but that I have no reason to doubt that in terms of order of magnitude, so, or approximation.
And it was 20, I think it's called the North Marina 2016 model. So it was in 2016 and would have used data earlier than that, going back 30 years, or
That's,
whatever you can remember. Is that right?
yeah, that's correct, yes.
Okay. And the North Marina 2022, which used 50 years, went back from 2021, 50 years, correct?
That sounds right. I can't recall exactly right now, but that sounds correct, yes.
Okay. And you picked 10 years out of that entire range to use, 2004 to 2013.
That's correct.
Why those 10 years?
Well, there was a lot of discussion going on about this. My recommendation at the time was that we wouldn't have enough time to do a full transient analysis and look at every time step. Those 10 years, I believe, I discussed with Ms. Nelson, and she recommended that general period as a time indicative of like a water period that would be demonstrative. So to be honest, we didn't put a lot of thought into those particular 10 years as opposed to another 10 years, at least to my recollection. But I received guidance from Miss Nelson, so that might be useful to ask her.
Let me ask you though, when you said we, in terms of doing the modeling and utilizing these 10 years, did you mean you and Mr. Peck?
Yes, I did. Yes, I do.
Okay, and for Mr. Lily's sake, Mr. Peck is the one other person who works at Shannon and Wilson with a geohydrology background?
Well, there are several people at Shannon Wilson that have a geohydrology background, but Mr. Peck and I are the two that work on numerical groundwater models.
Oh, okay, I apologize for generalizing too much. Your team is the two of you, correct?
And Ms. Christy Connolly, who's a GIS specialist. So we work with her to transfer information from the models to GIS for the development of maps and figures.
Okay. And when you worked in 2015 to 2017, you had a team of 4 or 5, isn't that correct?
Well, in my company, at that time, that was with my former company, and my former company was a team of 4 or 5 people. On this particular project, North Marina groundwater model at the time, I worked with one other person to do the review of the model, the 2016 model. I worked with my colleague Kevin Day, and then prior to that, we did some very preliminary document review that I did with my colleague Brent Meyer.
Okay. So Mr. Peck was new in 2022 to this task.
That's correct.
We can take this down, Mr. Lilly, please.
Okay, we'll stop screen sharing this exhibit. Go ahead.
You're aware, Dr. Kincaid, that Hydrofocus did field work in connection with their evaluation?
Yes.
They measured gradients?
I believe they measured groundwater levels and then calculated gradients. Yes.
Pardon me. I actually think you can't measure a gradient. You can only measure groundwater levels. Is that correct?
Unless there's been a new tool developed since that I'm not aware of, that would be how you measure gradients. Yes.
Okay, so I apologize for an inartful question. And others have measured groundwater levels for purposes of calculating gradients, correct?
Yes, I'm sure.
Well, and you know that the HWG team has done that.
Yes, to the extent that it's been reported in the reports that I read, yes, I do know
Okay.
that.
But your team did not do any field work.
That's correct.
Now, seawater intrusion is an important component of this hearing focus. You're aware of that.
Yes, I am.
And there's been a lot of historic tracking of seawater intrusion. You're aware of that.
Yes.
And you didn't review any of the data collected by others on historic seawater intrusion, correct?
Other than looking at the published maps, and that some of which have been, presented in this proceedings, no, I haven't looked at the data from which those maps were derived.
Do you recall my asking you at your depot where actually you may back up. We talked about the extent of seawater intrusion at your depot, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And I used a phrase that was probably more of a layman's phrase, like, where's the edge of it or the front of it?
Yes.
Okay. And I think you told me that the proper words are the freshwater saline water interface.
Not really a big person for vernacular, but that would be an appropriate way to describe it. Yes.
Okay. Is it okay if I use the word edge then?
Sure. That's absolutely.
Okay. So I asked you if you knew where the inland edge of the seawater intrusion was in the 180-foot aquifer. Do you remember my asking you that question?
Yes, I do.
And you remember your answer was no, I do not?
That's correct. Yes.
And you didn't know how close it was to any of the MCWD wells, other than perhaps the spatial maps that are included in your slides.
Yes, but I believe in my testimony, I said that, or in my deposition, I said that I've seen how it is depicted by other people on both sides of this argument. It appears that people acknowledge that MCWD's wells are close to that edge.
So I asked you how close, and you said you didn't know, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Can we put up CalAm 79? And we'll leave it on the first page for a minute, just so we can all identify what document it is.
Okay, just give us a moment. We'll post exhibit CalAm 79. Okay, maybe Ms. Mullen, if you can just zoom out a little bit. There we go.
I believe Dr.
Yes,
Kincaid.
Scroll down. This okay.
Oh,
So the first page says rebuttal testimony appendix prepared by Peter Leffler. So
dated August 2022.
oh yes, at the top it says August 22. Thank you. So Mr. or Dr. Kincaid, are you familiar with this exhibit?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead, Mr. Osias, and let us know what page you want us to.
Yes, but first, I believe Dr. Kincaid, when I asked you about this document at your depot, you said you were aware of it and you had quickly reviewed it, or something to that effect. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I went through this document looking for comments that would be would have been or were directed at the work that we did, or at the modeling work in general.
Okay.
But I didn't read the entire document in detail.
Could we go to PDF page 109?
Okay,
And I'm afraid you have to zoom out a little bit for this to be seen.
okay, we have PDF page 109 of exhibit CalAm 79 on the screen. Go ahead.
Maybe one more click out, just so we can make sure that the full legend is visible at the bottom.
Okay, we'll zoom out one time, one more notch. Oh, whoops, I think that was 2 notches. There we go. That's pretty good.
All right. Have you seen this figure either from this appendix or anywhere else before, Dr. Kincaid?
Yes, and in fact, I used it in some of my, or maybe not this particular one, but as you say, there's multiple versions, replications of this general figure. So I used a version of that in some of my rebuttal testimony.
And as far as you know, this is a illustration of historic seawater intrusion as compiled by the Monterey County Water Resource Agency.
Yes.
You don't have any reason to doubt it, do you?
Well, yes. I mean, I think I know from my own experience that maps like these tend to be simplifications. I presume that this map was created by contouring salinity levels measured in wells, but I've seen other maps that indicate the presence of fresh water in pieces or parts of where this map would indicate that there's seawater intrusion. So I believe that it's not that I don't trust the overall, what this map says overall, that seawater intrusion has been advancing. But I wouldn't expect to pick any point on this map and go out and drill a well and be able to exactly replicate what it says.
You have done nothing in your work to create an independent version of this map, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Can I interject?
No.
Not at this point. No, I don't think so, Ms. Nelson. I think Mr. Osias is allowed to continue with his questions of Dr. Kincaid.
And at least for general orientation purposes, Dr. Kincaid, I just want to make sure everybody understands where we are. There's a reddish blob on the coastline with some gray area around it, representative, I presume, of the proposed slant well site and the Cemex property. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And is that how you would interpret this figure?
Yes, it's how it's described in the legend. So
Okay. And then there's different shades of green and yellow. And you'll see that there's a legend that has the dates that correspond to those colors.
yes.
Okay. So, do you believe seawater intrusion has been happening in this area for a long time?
Yeah, I have no reason to doubt that the historical information that's presented. So yes.
And the edge has been progressing over time. I'm sorry, I don't know if I asked you if this was for the 180-foot aquifer, but it is for the 180-foot aquifer, correct?
That's what the map says, yes.
Okay. It's so the seawater intrusion edge has been progressing farther inland in general over time, correct?
Yes, that's how I interpret this map.
Do you have information to the contrary?
No.
Okay. And you see MCWD wells 31, 30, and 29 identified on this map.
Yes, I do.
Okay. And at least ignoring scale for 1 minute, the illustration suggests that the seawater intrusion edge is near those wells, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The location of this seawater intrusion over these many, many years has not been caused by the proposed desalination slant wells, correct?
Oh, well, I guess that would be obvious. They're not operating yet. So it's correct.
Okay, I mean, I can get lots of things wrong, so sometimes I have to ask questions where I think I know the answer, just to make sure I do.
Well, I'm going to ask, there's just some, I mean, obviously that's fundamentally correct, but Dr. Kincaid, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the test well, the pumping of the test slant well would have any effect on seawater intrusion?
Yes, I generally, and I have to admit, as I have said, I haven't done independent research here, but seawater intrusion is a problem that's caused by extraction. So additional pumping will exacerbate, can be expected to exacerbate seawater intrusion. So the map that I infer, that what I see in front of me is a map that demonstrates the effect of the totality of pumping in these hydrologically connected groundwater basins and the advancement of seawater intrusion because of overpumping.
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously, Mr. Osias, what you said is generally correct, but I think that there's that one slight caveat that we should make sure we don't ignore.
Well, and I think, Mr. Lilly, that makes me want to ask my next question, which I hadn't
Go ahead.
thought of, which is essentially based on what you just said about extraction, any extraction contributes to seawater intrusion. Is that correct?
Once the basin is overdrafted, then I would agree with that, as long as we're talking sensibly about extraction within the general area, within the area of that is hydrologically connected, then yes, I would agree that any pumping exacerbates the problem.
So the pumping historically, actually, let me back up. Do you know how long MCWD wells 29, 30, and 31 have been pumping?
I do not.
Or the historical volumes?
I do not.
And would that be relevant to determining their contribution to seawater intrusion?
It would.
As far as you know, seawater intrusion has not stopped yet, correct?
As far as I know, that is correct.
I'm afraid I'm going to ask another obvious question. Bear with me. The fact that seawater is intruding to the east in the 180 is consistent with describing the gradient in the 180-foot aquifer as landward.
That's correct.
And for the edge of the seawater intrusion front to move towards Monterey Bay, the gradient would have to be seaward.
I doubt that's correct. That is something that I would want to evaluate, like has been recommended since my first involvement in this, which is that what should be done here is a variable density model to address things like that. But generally speaking, a change in gradient and changes in the amount of recharge, the amount of fresh water entering the system has an effect on the position of the edge, as you describe it, between the saltwater and the freshwater interface. We know those, so the degree to which it has to be seaward to affect any change at all in the position of that gradient is something that would have to be evaluated, or I would have to evaluate before I could answer.
So my question was probably both incomplete and too simplistic for you to draw a conclusion, I think. Is that fair?
Yes, I suppose that would be a shorter way of saying it.
Okay, so it's current seawater is currently moving inland because of a landward gradient in part. That's correct, right?
I would infer that the degree to which the seawater intrusion is continuing to move landward is because of a continuing steepening gradient. Although it may have not reached equilibrium yet with whatever gradient is established there. But it is because of the landward gradient. It is because of drawdown in the aquifer that has caused groundwater levels to be below sea level that has resulted in seawater intrusion.
Okay. So I want to come back to discuss gradient with you, which we probably don't need this picture for, but before I do that in general, if
You
we
want
could
us to
look,
take it down or leave it up?
no, I'm going to substitute a different picture, Mr. Lee. I was just going to look to get the number for you.
Oh, okay. Is it in?
Now,
the
you can
same-
take it down, but there's really not going to be an in-between. I'm going to ask for another exhibit to be put up.
Okay, is the other figure in the same exhibit or in a different exhibit?
No, it's on it. It's not in this. It's
Okay.
actually MCWD 117.
Okay, so we'll take down that exhibit and put up exhibit 1, MCWD 117.
And I'd like to go to slide 28.
We will get there. Okay, we now have posted exhibit MCWD 117 and we're on slide 28, which I think Ms. Mullen will make bigger in just a minute. Just takes a minute to download. There we go. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Osias. And
Thank you.
maybe that's too big. Maybe you can scroll out one just to make sure we have all the borders. Just gonna zoom out one notch. Whoops. I guess that was in fact, okay, go back. So my bad. That's fine. So we do have the entire exhibit. Go ahead, Mr. Osias.
Thank you. Dr. Kincaid, this is a slide from Ms. Nelson's direct testimony. You recognize it?
I do.
Did you help create it?
I did not help create this slide to the extent that it was somehow facilitated by the various work products that I've exchanged with Ms. Nelson, then that could constitute help, I suppose, but I did not have a direct hand in the construction of the slide.
Okay. I want to make sure you look it over for enough time to make sure you understand it.
Okay. I understand it.
Okay. Does it reflect your opinion?
Yes. I don't see anything to disagree about.
Okay. Do you presume that the 3 yellow dots in the Monterey subbasin are the 3 wells, 29, 30, and 31?
That is how they're defined in the legend. Yes.
I didn't see the numbers in the legend. I'm sorry.
It just says that those are the production wells screened within the 180-foot, 400-foot aquifers.
Oh, so you actually know that means they're well 29, 30, and 31.
I do by this time. We've had ample conversations about those 3 wells.
Okay. And they were on the graphic we were just looking at before with seawater intrusion, correct?
I apologize, but I presume so. If you say they were, I have no reason to doubt that they were not.
Well,
Yeah, I'll just state for the record, they were there.
Thank you.
Well, in fact, I think Dr. Kincaid testified that it looked like the seawater intrusion front was near them.
Was near them. Yes. Yes, I
That
concede
is
that.
correct. Go ahead, Mr. Osias.
So, pardon my color characterization, what I believe are fuchsia lines are to suggest direction of flow, correct?
Yes.
And are they intended to suggest the extent of flow?
I don't believe so. I believe they're intended to represent the pattern of flow.
So the fuchsia line that goes through the 3 wells is not intended to suggest that seawater intrusion will reach those wells?
I can't speak to how Miss Nelson intended these to be represented. But
I can speak to it if you'd like.
Not
Well,
yet,
let's,
please.
so far, I'm, and if necessary, we can ask you about that, Ms. Nelson, but I think at this point, Mr. Osias has a right to ask Dr. Kincaid what his understanding of this is, and if you don't have an understanding of this specific detail, Dr. Kincaid, it's certainly reasonable for you to say so, since this is not your exhibit.
so I don't know the extent to which she intended to say that this is a fear, that this is what would happen, or that she simply used it to represent the pattern, or that she intended to say that this is what would happen. You'd have to ask her about that.
Okay,
But
so
it's-
Mr. Osias, if you want to ask any further questions about this particular issue, I think you do need to ask Ms. Nelson, and if you want to move on, that's fine, but it's not
No,
fair to keep
I
asking.
want to ask Dr. Kincaid.
Wait. Please wait till I'm done. I said, it's not fair to keep asking him to essentially speculate about someone else's exhibit. So anyway, go ahead.
Yes, I agree entirely. I want to ask his opinion, and illustrations are much easier than words. So we have a picture here that I want to ask him about, but only about his opinions.
Okay, that's an important limitation. Go ahead.
And Dr. Kincaid, you do not have an opinion that the seawater intrusion as depicted by the fuchsia arrow will reach the MCWD wells, correct?
That's correct. As I've said, I don't believe it's possible to predict with the tools that we have available to us, where the edge, as you've described it, will be as a consequence of the pumping at the proposed slant well. What I believe very strongly is that pumping at the proposed slant well, wherever that edge is, will cause the edge to move in the landward direction, which will undoubtedly, because of, as you described before, cause it to be closer to the MCWD wells that we're looking at than it already is. But I do not believe that we can say that it will be in a particular place, like that the MCWDs will, the edge will be past the wells or at the wells. I just believe that wherever that edge actually is today, it'll be farther landward as a consequence of pumping.
Now, based on the figure we just looked at about historic seawater intrusion and how the edge is moved inland, the flow paths have existed in these directions absent pumping at the slant well site, correct?
Yes, that's correct. This area is affected. Too much pumping, more pumping is occurring than can be sustained without seawater intrusion. And so the seawater intrusion has been advancing. And I can't say whether or not that's because pumping has continued to increase or because the aquifers have not yet reached a steady state to the pumping that exists. But I believe very strongly that the seawater intrusion is caused by the pumping, and that more pumping will cause more seawater intrusion.
And in your opinion, the fuchsia arrows that are not inside the capture zone already exist. It's just that the predicted impact in your mind of the slant well pumping will perhaps increase the extent of those paths. Is that fair?
Yes, I believe what's at issue is not the current condition, but the additive effects. And so this, in my mind, if you compare the title of the slide to the graphic, it's talking about what Ms. Nelson believes will be induced as a consequence of pumping. So there are already flow arrows in that direction that are contributing to the edge of the saltwater interface, and pumping will induce there to be more flow.
So it would then be fair to say that the entirety of these fuchsia arrows is not induced by the slant well pumping, correct?
For that, you'd have to ask Ms. Nelson. Given that the slide says induced, I would infer that she intends this to depict what she believes will be induced by the slant well pumping.
Okay. So do you have an opinion as to what the present volume of seawater intrusion is along these pathways?
I do not.
Do you have a present opinion as to what the rate, by that I mean distance over time, of seawater intrusion is along the depicted pathways?
I do not.
Now, if you're going to calculate the additional seawater intrusion caused by the slant wells, wouldn't you take the existing plus induced minus the existing, or would you not?
Yeah.
Actually, I said that badly.
No,
Let me rephrase it. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
If you modeled what the slant wells cause, and you got and you determined or predicted for you the total seawater intrusion, you would want to subtract out that which would occur anyway in order to calculate the amount caused by the slant wells.
Yes, but I feel necessary, as Mr. Lillias said before, I don't mean to be nitpicky, but there are two components to, I believe, what you're talking about. There is the amount, the quantity of water that flows through the domain, and then there's the salinity of that water. So what we can say from the modeling that is available to us is how the quantities of flows from various sources will change. What we can't say is the effect of those quantity changes on the salinity of the water at any point in the basin. So we can't say where the edge of the seawater freshwater interface will be, because that's defined on the basis of salinity. But we can say how the magnitude of flows from different sources will change based on the various versions of the North Marina groundwater model.
So I thought my question was about volume, and I'll repeat it to make sure it's clear that it's about volume. If you model the total volume of seawater intrusion with the slant wells running, the volume that the slant wells contribute would be the amount left after deducting the volume that would occur without the slant wells. Is that correct?
I think, Mr. Esiason, again, I am a little nitpicky here, but I think what you want to say is if he ran two scenarios, one which would be what I'll call with slant well scenario, and one would be a without slant well scenario, and determine the amount of, I'll just say, seawater intrusion under each of those scenarios, and then subtracted those, that would determine the effect of the slant wells on the seawater intrusion. Is that what you're trying to ask him?
Well, that's something I was going to get to, because that would be one model run minus another model run. But it'd be helpful to know.
Excuse me, I'm just disturbed when you talked about subtracting out, because I don't think you can subtract out in one model run. I think you have to do two different model runs to get to the point you're trying to address here.
Well, I'm just trying to zero in on the volume that's currently happening.
Okay.
And that shouldn't be treated as induced.
Right, so that's, if that would be the volume that would be modeled with the without project scenario, I think, isn't that what you're getting at?
It would be, but I thought he opined that he didn't know.
Oh, okay, well, go ahead and ask him if, I don't recall that, but I think if you're talking in terms of two different scenarios, two different modeling scenarios, it's gonna be a lot clearer for at least for me and probably for everyone else.
And to be clear,
Wait,
again, it's
wait
nitpicky, but
until he asks, Mr.
Okay,
Sias
right.
gets to ask questions, so let him
okay.
ask a question. I'm just trying to give a little guidance here, but Mr. Science, go ahead and ask your next question, but that's my suggestion is you ask questions in terms of model scenarios.
Let me ask a related question if I could start with it, please.
Go
Is
ahead.
the only way to identify the volume of existing seawater intrusion, is it by modeling?
I'm sorry, you use words like only. The method that I would use, because I'm a modeler, of course, would be modeling, and I would do it the way Mr. Lilly just described, and in fact, did do it in the way Mr. Lilly just described.
But that wasn't my question, because you're also a geohydrologist, or perhaps it's a hydrogeologist. So my question had only in it on purpose, because I want to know if that's the only way to determine the existing volume of seawater intrusion.
Then no, I'm sure the map that you showed just a minute ago was based on direct measurements of salinity or chloride in the aquifer. And then you could render calculations about the salinity differences and compare those with estimates of the porosity to get volumes of seawater intrusion. So that modeling would not be the only way to do that, no.
Do you know if anyone has done that? By that, I mean, estimated or determined the volume of existing seawater intrusion without a model.
Other than the map and the various versions of the map that we just discussed a minute ago, I am not aware of and have not read about efforts to document or quantify seawater intrusion in this area.
So going back to this illustration for 1 minute, again, not that you have to own it, but it's useful just for orientation. The yellow line on this is describing a capture zone, correct?
Yes.
And the fuchsia lines inside the capture zone stay inside the capture zone, correct?
Correct. They depict water flow paths that go to the wells.
Okay. And then it's also depicting that there's water flow paths not in the capture zone, which we've already talked about, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So again, not trying to ascribe to you any specific detail of these drawings, but the lines that are not in the capture zone, the ones closest to the capture zone bend more than the ones that are farthest away. Do you see that?
Yes.
And is to you, would you agree that a bend in that flow path, if it should occur, is caused by the influence of the capture zone?
Yes.
And would that slow the rate that water flowed along that path to get from point A to point B if it had to go through that kind of curve?
It's dependent on the hydraulic gradient. So it will go faster where the gradient is steeper and slower where the gradient is flatter. So if we in order to get the answer to your question, we'd have to aggregate the whole thing. So given that the gradients are different and even the hydraulic conductivities are different in this area, that would have to be an analysis.
I was trying to compare the no project to project for a minute. The flow path wouldn't bend towards the capture zone when the pumps were off, correct?
That's correct.
And therefore, a particle would move along that flow path faster when the pumps are off versus when the pumps are on and it has to take that curvy route, correct?
You're presuming that the gradient stays the same, and it won't. So the reason the pathway deflects is because the local gradients are changing, and therefore the velocity along the path changes as a consequence of the changing gradient. So there's two different questions built in there, and I can't answer the question as to how long it takes to get from the start of the line to the end of the line without aggregating the change in speed or change in velocity that will occur along the entire length of the line due to the change in gradients.
Okay, that's very helpful. So on the one hand, the path is longer when it curves,
Yes.
but that's not the entire story because there's a gradient potential change caused by the pumping, correct?
Well, if we believe the map, there's not a potential change, there's a change in gradient. So yes.
Okay, so we can take this picture down.
Okay, and while we're here, while we're moving on, Mr. Osias, I was targeting to take our lunch break from 12 to 1. Do you have an estimate for the additional time for your cross-examination of Dr. Kincaid?
Well, I sadly feel like I lost a fair amount of time in the discussion about Cerebral.
I agree completely. I'm not holding you to that. I just want to know where you are now.
Yeah.
That was certainly my fault.
No, that that wasn't my intent to communicate that.
It's
I'm
okay. Just tell me.
I'm
We're not
looking,
in the blame here. Just tell
I'm
me.
looking through
I'm
looking through my topics to try to give you the answer.
Yes.
Because I know if I give you that answer, I should be held to it.
Well,
best they can.
close anyway.
Yes. I would try to do it in an hour.
An hour more?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's quite a bit more than I thought you had yesterday. Can you just tell me what topics you plan to cover in, with Dr. Kincaid?
Yes. I plan to discuss gradient, which we were just starting with in this last one. Its relationship to capture zone and drawdown and superposition, because it gets modeled different ways, and those things are, some of those are products and some of those are influences. And sigma consequences, not what he knows about sigma, but what he modeled about sigma consequences. Crystallize his contrasting opinions with those of others. So we can see where they specifically disagree. That would be my try for.
Okay.
I hope you believe those are all relevant.
Well, at least at the outset, they appear to be relevant. We'll see when you get into the details. So this is what I'm going to do. We'll take our break now. I mean, we've been going now for a couple of hours since our last break. So we'll take a break from 12 to 1. And I'll say, Mr. Osias, I think your questions are pretty on point. Please just kind of go through them and see if there's any way you can streamline them at all. And this is very important, so I don't want to cut you off. on the other hand, I want to try to get this done. I'd like to finish today if we can. Although if we need to, we'll go into tomorrow. That's why we have the extra day or that extra day. So let's do that. Why don't you kind of go through and see to the extent you can streamline them. I'll just say while covering the points you think you need to. And we'll take a break from 1 to 2 and come back at 2 and go from there and see where we are. And just as a reminder to everyone, the way our recording works, we have to have a separate session. So for this session, this time for this break, please log off completely. And then just before 2 o'clock, we'll all log back on to a new session. So anything we need to cover before we take our lunch break? Hearing none, we'll take a break and I'll see you all at 2 o'clock. Thank you.